You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop, the podcast that explores solutions for sustainability and equity in water. I'm the host, Travis Loop. This is episode number 229, Navigating Federal Funding for Local Impact. Communities across the United States face significant challenges in accessing and effectively utilizing federal funds for water initiatives. The solution lies in leveraging these resources to empower grassroots organizations and address local water issues. This episode is a recording from a session at River Network's River Rally, during which Celina Mahabir of Community Water Center and Kirsten Shead of Milwaukee Water Commons discuss strategies. They delve into the how of navigating federal funding, ensuring dollars reach the places most in need, and advancing impactful long-term solutions. Additionally, they explore the role of philanthropy and share examples of early successes from federally supported projects. Let's start with Kirsten. Could you talk about your organization, what you do for folks that aren't familiar, and your connection to this issue of the federal funding and getting it down to the local level?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Kirsten. I'm one of the co-executive directors of Milwaukee Water Commons. Milwaukee Water Commons, we were really founded, it's going on 10 years ago in Milwaukee when we started having a conversation about being a water-centric city, we were the fresh coast. That conversation was really being driven by, in our assessment, business and government, maybe a little bit of academia, but the community really wasn't involved. And so out of a long process of conversations and especially engaging artists and community leaders and advocates and really reaching outside of the traditional water sector that existed in Milwaukee along with partnering with existing programs in Milwaukee, we formed a Water City agenda which had talking points and plans around drinking water and green infrastructure and shouldn't everyone be able to swim. And so we're really rooted in Milwaukee. That's where our heart is, but we've been pulled more and more over the years, I think because of the way that we've centered environmental justice and the way that we've taken a systems approach to looking at inequitable structures. We've been pulled more and more into the policy space. And so we feel this tension as an organization, like as we're shaping things or speaking into things in coalition at a regional space or at the national space, to also continue to go back and make sure that our roots stay true to the people of Milwaukee, especially Black and brown communities in Milwaukee, in a hyper-segregated city. What is healthy, sustainable, thriving water and community look like? So all of our work tucks into that. I think my role on the panel today and the place that I'm feeling most excited about is just there have already been so many conversations. As Catherine said, I've heard so many really detailed, strategic conversations about how we are going to do right as best we can in this moment of what feels like urgency and also opportunity. And so I think our conversation up here is going to be more, I don't want to say high level, like it's bigger or better, but more kind of that universal level, looking out and kind of making some commentary on what's working, what's not, what maybe we need to keep an eye out from our perspective, and how we can make sure to continue to center environmental justice in this work.
All right. Thank you, Kirsten.
Yeah.
Celina, for folks that might not be as familiar with the Community Water Center, talk about your organization and talk about your connection to federal funding and getting it to the local level.
Well, first of all, hi, everybody. This is my first River Rally and my first time talking on a panel. So I've been complaining to a couple of people that I already know that I'm pretty nervous. But so for those of you who don't know, Community Water Center, or CWC for short, is a frontline, community-based, community-led organization out in the rural regions in the Central Valley, Central Coast of California. We work primarily in low-income farm worker communities of color when it comes to drinking water and wastewater solutions, and pretty much the whole 9 yards of policy advocacy, project design, project implementation, things like that. So our work started from the ground up, really. We started with community members coming to Susanna Dan, our executive director, saying, we want to know what's in our water. We want to know how we can change this, and really dealing with a lot of pollution from big agriculture and things like that. So at the state level, we were responsible for AB 685 in 2012, the Human Right to Water, which was passed in California. So that's really been the crux of a lot of our work. We work in the groundwater space, we work with all the state agencies, the state legislature, and we've kind of taken what the human right to water means in California out into the federal space now. So where we started off with saying we wanted clean, safe, and affordable drinking water for all Californians, that's expanded to say clean, safe, and affordable drinking water for all. So that's a huge part of the work we do in the federal space, and that's kind of where I come in. So I do a lot of just bringing the work we do on the front line and in our communities to the federal space. A lot of decisions and a lot of conversations in the federal space around funding, around regulations, anything like that. It's very behind closed doors, or it requires a certain audience, and community members typically don't have a seat at that table. So we kind of serve as that funnel to make sure they do. And just, like I said, working on the whole 9 yards in the federal space. So some of our big priorities are affordability, which we do with some of our friends from the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, working on LIHWAP, the Low Income Household Water Assistance Program, and LIRA, the National Low Income Rate Assistance Program, funneling through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, and really just making sure that a lot of it is centered in community, centered in Justice 40, and making sure that things are informed by community and not necessarily just delivered to communities without understanding what is the need, how community members feel, and building that trust. So that's a lot of what we do and a lot of what I do. So.
All right, thanks, Celina. So you just mentioned, you said what communities need. And I think that's the first step, right, to any of this work, any of the work you all do. But then even when it comes to getting federal funding, starting with, well, what does the community need? What kinds of work do they need? What kinds of funding do they need? How do you go about figuring that out? How do you go about identifying, okay, what does a community need? And then, yes, you'll go figure out the funding piece.
I mean, it's such a... the question, I feel like it really depends on your community, right? So that's the first question, is like, who is our community? What community are we talking about? Let's get detailed. And I think it's what does our community need, and where's the funding we can go for? And right now I feel like it's this opposite that's happening, is like, there's all this funding, and what does our community actually need? And so if I feel like for an organization like ours, we're more watching the federal funding come down and trying to help shape the priorities that are being set. So taking our existing knowledge, we're not just starting the community conversation now. I mean, and if you are just starting the community conversation now, great. The best time to start it is yesterday, and the next best time is now. So, but if you have existing relationship and history in a community, I think it informs, what do we need? What does our neighborhood need from the last 20 years now that there is funding available? But I think that community need piece needs to continue throughout the funding process. So even once, funding has been allocated to our city to replace lead laterals, how are we, monitoring that? How are we shaping the workforce development around that? How are we really advocating that the prioritization of some communities first, right? So I think it's the community need needs to be considered, and keep going back to that throughout, from the finding the funding all the way through the final implementation of the project.
Great points. What would you say on that, Celina?
Well, first and foremost, I think it'd be concerning if our organization was called Community Water Center and we didn't center community. So Community Water Center obviously has community at the core of everything we do. We have office locations in the communities we work in, so Central Coast, Central Valley, and we don't do anything without community input. We work alongside a self-organized coalition of residents in all of our communities known as La Asociación de Gente Unida de Agua, which is, like I said, community-led coalition we work alongside, because we always say we don't work on behalf of the communities, we work with them, we work for them. And so we spend a lot of time, on the ground with them. We have our community solutions team going door to door, spending days in, days out, finding out how their water is, testing wells, aligning our priorities with them. And then we also have monthly check-ins with all CWC staff and all residents to make sure we're all learning from them what's going on in their communities, and they can also learn on the flip side what we're doing in the advocacy space. And a big thing also is we try to create spaces that are as accessible as possible, because so much of this information, I mean, there's a plethora of funding and regulations and all these things that people need to learn about, and a lot of it is made and designed to be inaccessible to these communities. So we try to break down some of those barriers as best as we can, whether that be through language access by, translating information, or technological barriers. We'll set up folks to join our Zoom calls and have them speak to issues, or we might even do, we might be the ones that are able to host events and have these meetings in community spaces where they can work, because they have certain lifestyles, they have certain responsibilities, and we want to make sure we're catering to that. Which I think is really important when you're sharing this kind of heavy information.
Great points. So flipping the view from, looking at the community, working with the community, assessing with the community, all this federal funding that's out there, going to all these different agencies for all these different programs, how do you then navigate, as the title of this session is, how do you navigate the options out there and identify, okay, let's go for this program, let's go for this pot of money, again, given how complex and massive this is right now?
Oh, okay.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think something that we try to do is also kind of demysticize, I suppose is the word, for frontline organizations that do want to get involved in the federal space. There is a bit more of a pushback on frontline organizations being involved. It's a really complicated process, knowing who to talk to, where to talk, when to talk. So for us, I think our thing was just making sure we didn't wait for an invitation to have those conversations. So we spent a lot of time, building relationships with offices, with agency staff, things like that. And I think something that's really important that we've learned is knowing who to tap for what priority. Because again, there's just so much federal funding out there for so many different things, and sometimes they overlap. So for example, we work in rural communities. We would maybe look at the Farm Bill's rural development title at USDA, or if you're looking at affordability, you look to LIHWAP at HHS, or if you're talking about the SRFs, that's EPA. So kind of learning how to know who to tap for what, but also understanding that so much of your work kind of hinges on what the political environment is in the federal space. Because, 1 week they might be very gung-ho about talking about the environment and about water, and then another week it's focused on the border. So just really being in tune with what's going on kind of just helps you figure out when it's most strategic to figure out when to attack what part of the funding that you want.
Kirsten, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm thinking about coalitions, and a lot of our work happens in coalition, and I'm going to give a couple of specific examples. We have an area of concern that's really active right now in Milwaukee, and it's really exciting. I think it's getting some really good press because there's been some efforts done by community-based organizations and partners on the ground to really push back on the traditional structure of how AOCs are done and how GLRI funding is done. And that has been a very collaborative effort, and I think that it's shaping the federal funding, right? That's optimistic to think that we can totally shape federal funding, but it is. It's saying this is a model of how community engagement could really be centered here. This is a model of how we can pay people to do the kind of work that maybe we previously asked folks to volunteer to do. And we know the privilege and how white and affluent and retired the volunteer space can be, right? It's not 100%, but there's a privilege there. And so I think coalition spaces, especially ones that have some history, have a real strong potential to, I think, not to guide a city's approach, in our context, a city or a region's approach to federal funding. So around our area of concern, there's some great shaping happening, and I got to shout out all those 25 partners that are working on that. We also have a water equity task force in Milwaukee that's been meeting for now probably 6 years or something, talking about water jobs. And workforce development, if anybody remembers, workforce development in the water sector wasn't exactly a booming conversation a decade ago. It was kind of that fringe conversation, right? It's been pulled to the center because of this federal funding. And so I think having some real good analysis of what it's going to take to really get our communities the jobs that are coming with the federal funding. Also, there's a power of a coalition behind that, not just any one organization, and not just putting all that on one federal institution to have a policy around it. Like, we need to have the power of coalitions moving that.
Along with this historic federal funding has come the establishment of some technical assistance providers and funding navigators, these different portals and tools to help organizations and others access and navigate, right? Very, very curious from your perspective and the perspective of folks in the room, how these are working. I know that these are new, right? It's new processes. Things aren't always smooth, but how's it going using these TA centers and different navigators?
Not particularly well, but again, it's because so many of these systems and these resources are designed to make it harder on groups like ours that are working in communities that look like ours, right? I think something that's really important to think about, and something that we always make as a distinction for CWC, is we don't necessarily get the money ourselves. We kind of just make sure it gets into the right hands. And with that, it's a lot of hoops to jump through as far as, dealing with people on the ground, dealing with local government, dealing with accessing these portals. And there's 20 different steps to get a crumb of what's out there. And then also just, again, our communities are not fully in the loop of what's even out there. So a lot of the times we'll tell them about something that's supposed to be accessible to the community, and they're like, well, I've never heard of that, or I've never been able to access that. So I think that's made our job a little bit harder. I do think it's also a little bit hard sometimes with, it's a double-edged sword, right? With the kind of historic levels of funding you see with like the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, where this huge pot of money is going to agencies that might not have ever received that level of funding. So for example, the Bureau of Reclamation, we've tried very hard to get in touch with them. And I think it's a lot easier for them to say, yes, let's check these boxes and get these projects done on shovel-ready projects where they're just ready to go, versus in communities that do look like ours, where they still have a lot of steps to go through with the project design and implementation. So I think it's a step in the right direction, being able to at least try to receive that feedback. I think it's really hard to even get that feedback there in the first place, which is kind of just the issue that we're running into.
I mean, it's interesting because you hear the agencies and the administration talk about trying to make sure this money gets to these under-resourced communities in places it hasn't been before and needs to go. So the thinking is there. They have set up the technical assistance centers and these portals. But again, how's it going from your perspective?
I mean, I feel like we're all saying somewhat of the same thing, which is I'm glad that there's an effort, right? And I know that there's folks in the room that are working on this and that are trying to make it as accessible as possible and trying to take down as much red tape as we can, right? But the urgency and the pressure is real. And I feel like for a lot of frontline communities, a lot of smaller nonprofits, a lot of smaller municipalities, I mean, even just in the last 4 days, that conversation just keeps coming up. Like the pressure and the urgency and the how are we going to do this right? And how are we going to really work to interrupt the parts that the system is built to not be equitable, right? I think there's somewhat of an agreement that like if we just sent money through the existing system, we will not result in equity of distribution. And, I think a lot of us are seeing this as an opportunity to shift the system, right? We're putting this pressure on it anyway. Let's shift the system and make sure that we don't come to the end of this historic investment and see the disparity of who really benefited and who did.
I'll clap for that one. That's good.
I'm really appreciating the honest conversations that are happening and the acknowledgement that I think there's so many people trying to do better, to do their best to really shift these systems. And it's painful to feel like I'm trying really hard and then people get on the front stage and they say your system sucks. but it's I think we're all aiming at something that we haven't found a way to get there yet. And these kinds of conversations are what kind of shift it.
Well, there are people in the room, like you said, that are involved in some of this assistance and portals and so forth. What are some possible solutions? What are some ways to maybe fix some of this assistance in these portals and try to streamline and simplify and make it more equitable? It's always easy for us to complain, right? But let's bring solutions to the table too. Any ideas?
I think just understanding that not everyone accesses information in the same way is a very big thing. So again, the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, we joined together when EPA put out notice for public comment for their meaningful engagement policy. We had a lot to say on that. Definitely would share that. But yeah, just making things more accessible in a way that the community can respond to make sure that they understand where this money needs to go, first of all, but also just making that information more accessible than just an online portal or just one way of doing this process, which is easier said than done. I mean, it's a huge country. There's projects all across the country, but really just being more intentional about making the information more simplified, especially knowing that it's usually frontline organizations that are bearing the brunt of that work of accessing the information, sharing it with the communities that need it, and things like that.
Kirsten, any ideas?
I mean, my best suggestion is that our partnerships just need to be strengthened. I mean, I think I appreciate the EPA and folks that are really on that technical side continuing to reform that process and to keep taking like what can we cut, what can we simplify, what can we streamline. I mean, that is your expertise, it's not mine. But I think that the partnerships and the conversations that we have around that across, I'm thinking of like our conversations with our local utility, and having transparency and understanding of the barriers they have when they're accessing these funds versus the barriers we might have. I think that's where some of the special sauce is going to come from.
The other thing that you mentioned, and that has come up a lot, is the need to change the system for the long term, right? Not just this moment, but how are things going to be restructured so that going forward, communities in need can get funding that's there and resources that's there. So any thoughts? These are putting a lot of pressure on you here, right? Like how can we start changing the system fundamentally for the long term, not just this funding moment?
I mean, one of the ways we look at it is we keep coming back to how is this actually shaping or implementing environmental justice principles, right? So we look at it under three environmental justice approaches. We need to see procedural justice, right? How is the process centering environmental justice? How are meetings accessible? How are documents accessible? How are we can we do this without meetings or documents? Like, is there another way? Then there's distributive justice. How are we looking at the distribution of these resources? Are we prioritizing most impacted communities first? Can we bake that in? I mean, that's where I think we talk a lot about, if we're talking about structural change, the structure needs to outlast the beneficent people who are in those roles right now, right? So you might have a really good actor in your local water utility or your local, common council, but if they leave, have we structurally changed the approach so that EJ procedural justice will continue after them? And then the third environmental justice principle is really restorative justice. And are we using and leveraging these funds to right historic wrongs? And if we're not, then we're not actually doing environmental justice. We can diversify our meetings all we want. The impact is not going to be a just and thriving community. And so I think, in Milwaukee, restorative justice looks like who has had access to waterfront spaces in the last 100 years and who has been removed from them. And if we're doing restoration work, we know that that's going to make these properties really valuable, right? We know from other peers that have worked in other areas of concern the challenge of privatization of those spaces where all this federal money has been invested. How can we structurally shape procedure now so that 25 years from now we haven't made this huge historical investment and then that all gets snatched up by the folks that would have had it before?
Ideas for improving the technical assistance, the resources. That's all part of changing the system. But yeah.
No, but also that is a very tough act to follow. No, I think something that people don't talk about enough as well is just the United States does not look anything like it did when so many of these systems were put in place. Whether that be, the Safe Drinking Water Act, we're celebrating 50 years there are still a million Californians without access to clean and safe drinking water. And that's just who we know of. And, that's just California. That's a reality for people across the country. The SRFs were created in the 80s and 90s. Again, still an issue, still not enough money. So understanding that you need to cater to communities that no longer look like the ones that were once served when these systems were put in place, but also understanding that these are communities that have experienced decades of disinvestment, of being left out of equitable resources when they needed it the most. So one check or one project completion is not going to solve the problem, right? There's a lot of things federal funding doesn't cover, for example, like operations and maintenance. And in communities that look like ours, you can go in and say, oh, well, we're going to provide X amount of funding, but who's sustaining the system after that project's done? Who's building the capacity with residents to be able to what's the word I'm looking for? To utilize that system and things like that. And then also just like remembering that with these systems in place, it's also a matter of states are also having to fill in the gaps of where federal funding still isn't reaching these communities. So there's a lot of like factors at play, but definitely understanding that it's not just a one-time investment. There needs to be sustained funding. We need to think about a post-BIL world and a post-IRA world because that mysticism is going to go away at some point in 2026.
It's coming quicker than we think. Yeah,
so
for sure.
we need to think about all of that in the long term.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Philanthropy, foundations, these funders, really curious what role you all think they can play in helping with this big puzzle, this big moment of federal funding coming down, different programs, let's get it to the local level, all these organizations that are trying to help make that happen while they're doing all their regular work. You've talked about the urgency, you've talked about the amount of workload. Again, how can some of the philanthropic organizations help during this moment?
Yeah, I've seen philanthropy really trying to lean in and be part of that bridge, and to say, we have this opportunity, and we know that we haven't had the investment coming up to this to be ready for it, right? We have some of the right people in the room. We know we need more people in the room, but how can we help? And I think I'm really grateful to see philanthropy and our foundations, especially a lot of people that are in this room or have been at River Rally, right, who are functioning as peer leaders along with us, thinking like, we have some resources. How do you see the strategy to apply them? I think one of the challenges of that is it puts a lot of pressure back on frontline organizations and community-based organizations to solve that too. Right? I don't know if anyone else has felt that in the room, but we've gotten a lot of calls from really good partner funders saying, how can we leverage this, right? What are you seeing? Where can we give some investment? How can we help shape this? And so, the whole system keeps coming back and putting the burden back on frontline organizations to be saying what the solution is. That being said, we're grateful for the support, right? And so I feel like it's an all hands on deck kind of moment. And what I think has been the most encouraging have been foundations in the philanthropic community that have really looked to community-based organizations or frontline groups and said, what do you really think? How is this actually feeling for you? And who've also circled back and said, I don't want to see this take you out. I don't want a well-intentioned program to put $20 million in your bank account and y'all can't handle it, right? Do we need do we need to build some new organizations? Do we need to build some other structures to manage some of this money that ultimately needs to get down into the community, but could really blow out, a grassroots organization that, just the amount of capacity it takes to get yourself up to speed to hold federal money, right? So I feel like that understanding and bringing that knowledge and that level of support and nuance to the relationships that the philanthropic community has with community-based organizations is a good thing. And I'd say, for those who aren't tracking it yet, be aware that it's a lot of pressure on small nonprofits to solve it, to police it, to hold accountable the work that's happening. I mean, we had a conversation about Justice 40 with a funder, really supportive funder, and it's like, can you go back to the federal government and tell them that they need to put some accountability measures in here, because there's a lot of talk about centering communities of color, but we have a really hard time getting any metrics, any accountability on once that project is actually happening. So I feel like funders also have a place of, there's some power there to move up the chain and to shape some things too, in addition to supporting us doing that advocacy.
Sure, absolutely. Great points. Celina, ideas for the role of philanthropy and foundations in this puzzle?
I think I would just plus one everything she said. I think just there is a certain level of legitimacy, unfortunately, that comes with philanthropy, and recognizing that certain organizations, if they're able to back a frontline organization that might not have as loud of a voice in certain spaces, that does help. That's helped us a lot in past projects and in past spaces we've been in. So, yeah, I think just that sense of legitimacy, but also a total plus one to the kind of burden that does get placed on frontline organizations to carry that load.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, this funding has been around for a couple years now. Do you have any examples of, early impacts from actually getting these dollars out? Any successes that you all have experienced?
Well, we've had, I will preface this, not everything is negative, but we've had successes with being able to have federal funding support projects getting across the finish line, especially in rural systems. We've had funding through USDA and agencies like that being able to help. But I think more importantly, something to highlight is just the non-impacts we've had of having not enough federal funding. California is such a big state. It is the largest recipient of the SRFs, but that's still not enough for what the need is in that state. And the states had to get creative with creating programs like the SAFER program. For folks who might know it, it's the safe and affordable fund for equity and resilience, which is essentially kind of a supplement to the SRFs that the state provides, because the SRF program doesn't necessarily reach all the disadvantaged communities that need that funding. And it covers things that federal funding doesn't, right? So a lot of that sustenance and things I talked about that we still need to see in these communities that have been disinvested in for so long, like operation and maintenance, capacity building, follow through. The SAFER program does fund that, SRFs don't. So it's a bit of a balancing act with what we've been able to do and not do with federal funding. But that's totally not to take away from what we have been able to do with it, right?
In Milwaukee, any impacts you all have been able to realize yet?
I think the GLRI funding that is, supporting our area of concern cleanup, like we're starting to feel the impact of that. I think the community engagement opportunity that's coming through that, the actual implementation of, river cleanups and lakeshore and things like that, we're starting to see it. I think like Celina, I feel like I don't want to be negative all the time, but part of my role is to be an agitator until the community actually feels the impact, right? So I can see it coming, right? And we, for example, on our drinking water, we have 70,000 lead laterals in Milwaukee, and we were talking about drinking water issues, going on a decade ago when this wasn't part of the national conversation and when we didn't have any funding. Now we have this opportunity for funding, right? We need all these service lines replaced. We have some funding coming from the federal government. That's all good things. What we don't have is the workforce pipeline for people to do that work. What we don't have is, the community real buy-in and trust that work's going to be done right and how we're going to do it. And so I think we got a long way to go to take this opportunity of, we have an investment, we can actually solve the problem. How are we going to, I'm going to be pleased when I know that, a local community resident actually feels the impact of those dollars.
You're in the water loop.